The days following that evening felt like an endless blur for Miriam. The mansion, once a sanctuary from the world, had become a cage. She found herself growing restless, almost agitated by the quiet that had once brought her comfort. The rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant chatter of the household staff, it all felt distant, alien. But amidst this growing disquiet, one thing remained constant: Daniel. He was everywhere she turned. His presence, once fleeting, had become a constant thread woven into the fabric of her daily life. It wasn't just the occasional car rides or brief exchanges anymore. Daniel had become her unwitting confidant, her anchor in a sea of emptiness. They spoke more often now, and with every conversation, the bond between them grew stronger, more undeniable. At first, it was the small, innocent moments. The way his voice softened when he asked how her day had been, the way he held the door open for her with a smile that, while professional, was warm enough to make her heart skip. His attentiveness was so different from the cold indifference she had become used to from Richard. But over time, the lines between professional and personal began to blur. Miriam would catch herself eagerly awaiting the next encounter, the next moment she would get to see him, speak with him. It was in the briefest of exchanges, those fleeting moments that no one else saw, where their connection truly began to blossom. One afternoon, after returning from a trip to the city, Miriam found herself walking into the garage, her mind wandering, lost in thought. She hadn't noticed Daniel standing there, polishing the gleaming black car. His voice interrupted her reverie, low and calm. "You're looking lost in thought, Mrs. Richardson." She blinked, looking up at him in surprise. There was a softness to his tone that caught her off guard, a sincerity that she hadn't realized she had been craving. "I suppose I am," she replied, a soft smile tugging at her lips. Daniel paused in his work, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Anything I can do to help?" Miriam laughed lightly, though the sound lacked the usual carefree nature she once carried. "No, nothing, just a lot on my mind." He didn't press further, but looked at her for a moment, his eyes soft and knowing, as if he could see right through the walls she had carefully built around herself. Miriam looked away, feeling an unfamiliar flutter in her chest, one she hadn't felt in years. She cursed herself inwardly, her thoughts racing. This was dangerous. He was the driver, an employee, and nothing more. She had to stop herself. But she couldn't. "I'll let you get back to work," she said, forcing herself to break eye contact, to sever the fragile connection that had been growing. Yet, as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze on her, the weight of his quiet attention. The rest of the day was a haze, her mind swirling with thoughts of Daniel. What had started as innocent exchanges now felt like something deeper, something more dangerous. Miriam tried to distract herself. She buried herself in books, took a long walk through the gardens, even tried to engage with Richard when he was home. But the nagging feeling in her chest remained, gnawing at her insides. That night, after dinner, Richard retreated to his study as usual. Miriam, sitting alone in the vast dining room, absent-mindedly sipped her wine, her thoughts once again drifting to Daniel. She knew she shouldn't feel this way. She was the wife of a billionaire. She had everything a woman could want, and yet she felt completely alone. Daniel, with his warmth and attentiveness, had become a stark contrast to the man she had married. Miriam had spent so many years trying to ignore the emptiness in her heart. She had tried to fill it with shopping, with dinner parties, with charity events. But nothing had worked. And now, in the least expected place, she had found someone who seemed to care, someone who made her feel alive again. It was madness, she thought, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling. The more she resisted, the more her heart seemed to pull her toward him. The next day, she found herself in the car again, Daniel behind the wheel. The air between them was different this time, charged with something unspoken. Miriam wasn't sure how it had happened, but she could feel the shift. There was a subtle tension in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. "You're quiet today, Mrs. Richardson," Daniel remarked, his voice soft but curious. Miriam's heart raced at the sound of her name on his lips. She had always been Mrs. Richardson to him, distant, untouchable. But today his words felt different, like an invitation, like a sign that they were no longer bound by formality. "I'm just thinking," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. Daniel nodded, though his eyes never left the road. The silence between them was comfortable, but it was also filled with an undeniable tension. Miriam could feel the pull between them, as if the universe itself was conspiring to bring them closer. She didn't want it. She couldn't want it. But it was happening anyway. Her breath caught in her throat as her thoughts spun in a million directions. As they neared the end of the ride, Daniel took a different route, one that led them through a quieter part of the estate, a secluded path surrounded by tall trees. Miriam didn't question it. It wasn't uncommon for him to take scenic routes to avoid traffic, but today everything felt different. When the car finally came to a stop, Daniel turned off the engine, but neither of them moved. The air was thick with tension, so palpable that Miriam could almost taste it. She felt her heart beat loudly in her chest, an urgency she couldn't explain. "I hope I haven't said anything to make you uncomfortable," Daniel said, his voice gentle, as though he could sense her unease. His eyes were warm, understanding, but there was something else there now, something deeper, something that mirrored the quiet longing in Miriam's heart. She shook her head, forcing a smile. "No, not at all," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Daniel didn't respond immediately, but he looked at her, his gaze intense. It was then that Miriam realized that this connection wasn't just one-sided. He had felt it too. The quiet understanding, the unspoken pull between them. And though they both knew it was forbidden, Miriam couldn't deny the way her heart fluttered at the thought of what could be. The moment stretched on, the silence growing heavier. Miriam could feel her body reacting to him, her heart pounding, her skin tingling. The desire was there, undeniable, and it terrified her. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I'm sorry if I've overstepped," he said, his voice low. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Miriam took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She wanted to respond, wanted to say something that would make everything feel normal again, but her words failed her. She didn't know how to fix this, how to pull herself back from the edge. All she knew was that, in that moment, she was utterly captivated by him. "I'm fine," she said softly, though her heart was anything but. "Thank you, Daniel." As they sat in the stillness of the car, the weight of the unspoken words between them pressing down, Miriam realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. Her heart had already begun to belong to another. The car ride ended with an eerie stillness that Miriam couldn't shake. As she stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the mansion's entrance, her mind was tangled in a haze of emotions she wasn't sure how to process. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed by this forbidden attraction. Daniel was her husband's driver. Nothing more. She had no right to feel what she was feeling, and yet the weight of her emotions pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. Every day, it felt as though she was edging closer to a line she knew she shouldn't cross, but the pull was undeniable. Miriam's days followed a similar pattern. She would wake up to the coldness of an empty bed, Richard still fast asleep from a late-night work session. She would go through the motions of her day, shopping, lunches, charity events, but nothing seemed to hold her attention like the moments she shared with Daniel. In every interaction, there was a spark. Each word spoken, every glance exchanged, felt like it held more meaning than it should. She had never imagined herself in this situation. A woman of her stature, married to one of the wealthiest men in the country, should have had everything she needed to be content. But it wasn't enough. She realized now that what she craved was something far beyond luxury. She wanted connection. Richard's indifference was like a slow poison, and it had been dripping into their marriage for years. Miriam hadn't noticed it at first. At first, it had been the late nights at the office, then the business trips, and finally, the cold silences. She had tried to fill that void with shopping sprees, lavish vacations, and events that put her in the spotlight, but none of it could bring her the one thing she desperately craved, someone who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. And then there was Daniel. The more Miriam thought about him, the more she realized how different he was from Richard. He didn't try to dominate the conversation with his opinions or drown her in the weight of his achievements. He simply listened. He had a way of making her feel heard, of making her feel like her thoughts mattered. His voice, his gentle, soothing tone, was like a balm to her weary soul. Every time he spoke, it felt as though the world slowed down, as though nothing else mattered but the two of them in that moment. One afternoon, as she stood in front of the window, watching the rain fall softly against the glass, Miriam caught a glimpse of Daniel walking across the garden, carrying a small package for her. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. Even in the dreary weather, he looked effortlessly handsome, the dark silhouette of his figure framed by the soft gray sky. He walked with a grace that seemed to contrast with the weight of the world that Miriam carried. He seemed so simple, so uncomplicated, yet his presence stirred something deep within her. "Mrs. Richardson." The sound of his voice behind her broke her thoughts. Miriam turned, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, Daniel," she said, her voice surprisingly breathless. She hadn't expected to see him this soon. "I've got a package for you," he said, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. His dark eyes twinkled, as though he found something amusing in their exchange. Miriam took the package from him, their hands brushing briefly. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, and she quickly pulled her hand away, as if she had been burned. She had to be careful. This, whatever this was, had to stop before it went too far. She couldn't afford to let herself get swept away by these feelings. "Thank you," Miriam said, forcing a polite smile. But her voice was shaky, betraying the storm that raged inside her. Daniel didn't leave immediately. Instead, he lingered for a moment, standing by the door. Miriam could feel his presence in the room, as though it surrounded her. There was a quiet tension between them, one that had been building ever since their first interaction. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both unsure of what to say or do next. The silence was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with a quiet, unspoken understanding. "I'll let you get back to it," Daniel said softly, as though sensing her discomfort. He turned to leave, but just before he stepped out, he hesitated. "If you ever need someone to talk to." His voice trailed off, but the meaning behind the words hung in the air. Miriam stood there, frozen for a moment. She couldn't respond. Not because she didn't want to, but because saying the words out loud would make everything far too real. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "I'll keep that in mind," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. As Daniel left the room, Miriam felt a pang of longing in her chest. She didn't want to admit it, but she needed him. She needed him in a way that terrified her. He had become more than just a driver to her. He had become her confidant, her escape. And as much as she tried to push those feelings aside, they only seemed to grow stronger. The days that followed were even harder to ignore. Miriam tried to focus on her duties, attending meetings, overseeing charity events, managing the household, but nothing held her attention like the thought of Daniel. He was just a man, after all. Just an employee. But the way he looked at her, with that quiet understanding, made her feel as though she was the most important person in the world. She tried to tell herself that it was just the loneliness speaking, that she was simply craving companionship, someone to share her life with. But deep down, Miriam knew it was more than that. Daniel had become something she couldn't control, a feeling she couldn't push away. And that thought scared her more than anything. One evening, as she wandered the halls of the mansion, she saw him again, standing by the door as he finished his duties for the night. Miriam felt her heart skip a beat, as it always did when she saw him. This time, there was no escaping the pull between them. He turned to her, catching her gaze, and for a moment the world outside seemed to disappear. There was only the two of them, standing in the quiet, dimly lit hallway, their breaths mingling in the stillness. "Good evening, Mrs. Richardson," he said, his voice as gentle as ever, though this time there was a hint of something deeper in his tone, something that Miriam couldn't quite name. "Good evening, Daniel," she replied, her voice soft, a tinge of vulnerability seeping through her carefully constructed mask. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was heavy with unspoken words, with emotions neither of them was ready to confront. Miriam felt her heart race, and before she could stop herself, she took a step forward, her body drawn to him. But then, just as quickly, she pulled herself back, her heart hammering in her chest. This wasn't right. She couldn't do this. Not with him. Not with anyone. Her life was already tangled enough as it was. "I should go," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "Thank you for everything, Daniel." He nodded, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "Of course. Have a good evening, Mrs. Richardson." As she turned and walked away, Miriam's mind raced. She knew that this, whatever it was, couldn't continue. The attraction, the connection, the longing, it was all too much. But deep down, she knew that it was already too late. She had already given her heart to someone she couldn't have. And now, there was no turning back.